Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Chasing Lullabies. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's how we begin all conversations nowadays. So it's really wonderful to see you all, and we have a fantastic Chasing Lullabies this evening. Um, Last week we began with quite a long exploration. We're not gonna do something entirely the same this week. I want to cover quite a bit of material this week, but I really gonna need some help developing some ideas as we continue along the way. And really, the question that will dominate, I hope, the presentation this evening, the question that I think needs to be asked by anyone reading the Torah with a sort of a fresh pair of eyes. And that's really what Chasing Lullabies is calling upon us to do. It's asking us, can we read the Torah with a fresh pair of eyes? Can we all of a sudden just stand back and say, well, what's going on here? The question is, why Abraham? What is it about Abraham that merits, that allows him to be the person who is going to provide the answer to the conundrum that we've so far built over the past 2 weeks? So just to bring us back over the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about a certain move, a move away from unity, away from wholesomeness, into a splintered individuality. Almost like a creation is the splintering off into separate pieces, and then the action, the heroic action of an individual is to come back into that unity. So we describe, for example, in the creation of Adam and Eve, that they are meant to be this unity with God. They splinter off, they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They eat from that tree of knowledge and so become separate from God. And the idea is that then they should be able to bring themselves back. It didn't work. It was a setup, but it didn't work because the splintering continued on and on until God needed to almost recreate the world. And we saw echoes. We saw echoes of the creation account in the account of the flood in the story of Noah. As people became inured, they became almost content with their status of individuality. And that's where we saw this Noah will become Zeyunachamenu. He will create a comfort for us as we become sort of, we treat the symptom, not the cause. We treat the fact that the land is cursed with a plow rather than treating the cause, which is that we're distant from God, by trying to return to God. And we said that somehow Abraham is going to present the answer. Abraham is going to be the one to bring us back to a close relationship with God. But what is it on Abraham's CV, his resume, that should warrant that he is the person to bring us back? What does God see in Abraham's character that Abraham is chosen? It's almost like, there's a rabbinic selection committee, so there's a patriarchal selection committee, and they go around ancient Mesopotamia looking for the right fit for the patriarch of the Jewish people, or of this selected nation. And what is it that the patriarchal selection committee see when they come across Abraham? It's interesting because Noah does have a resume. Noah, we find his resume in the Torah. We find he's listed as a righteous man. Tzaddik Hayah. He was a righteous man. Now, whatever that means, however we understand his righteousness, the text says he's righteous. Abraham doesn't have any sort of moniker of righteousness. So you might say, whoa, we all know what Abraham did. We know Abraham was the one who was the first monotheist. There was that story where he went out as a young lad, and he went and he looked up at the sky, and he saw the sun beating down on the earth, giving the earth its energy. And he said, wow, the sun must be in charge. So he starts to worship the sun. And then actually something strange happens, because clouds come and they block out the vision of the sun. So he says, wow, the clouds must be all powerful. So he starts to worship the clouds. But then some winds stir up and they blow the clouds away. And he says, wow, the winds are even more powerful than the clouds. And the clouds are even more powerful than the sun. It must be that the wind is the most powerful of all. And he starts to worship the wind. And then he realizes that this whole thing is going around in circles, and there's no force of nature that is in charge. There must be a force above the forces of nature, and he intuits God. So that's probably what Abraham, that's on his CV. That's the moniker. He's the first monotheist. He understands that there's a grand unifying force. You know, it's amazing that nowadays one of the greatest physics theories is the grand unification theory. Abraham understood that. That must be what was Abraham's merit. The only problem with that is, if anyone's reading the parasha on Shabbat, did you find that story in the Torah anywhere? No, it's a medrash. Ah, it's a medrash. Okay. I mean, that's not to say that's not an important story. It's a really important story, but it's a medrash. Okay, so what does the text say about Abraham? Oh, so maybe you'll say, I know Abraham. It's not just that he was the first monotheist, he was the first sort of like philosopher thinker. He was the first activist, the first person to fight for monotheism. Because you know, there's that story when Abraham, his father was an idol worshiper, not just an idol worshiper, he was an idol merchant. He used to sell idols to everybody else. And one day when his father was out on an errand, so Abraham goes around and he smashes all the idols in the workshop, and he just leaves the largest idol with some sort of bludgeon in his hand. And he's and when his father comes back, his father's beside himself. His whole livelihood has been smashed. He says, "What happened here?" Abraham says, "You should have seen it, Dad. You should have seen what happened. It's unbelievable." Because the idols, they started fighting. They were really hungry, and they started fighting, and they started punching each other and beating each other up until the big one just went around with his bludgeon and smashed the living daylights out of all the rest. And then he was just left behind. His father said, "You idiots, they're just idols. They're just pieces of clay." Abraham says, "Exactly." And Abraham is this activist who will go around spreading the word of monotheism to the world. So maybe that's the reason Abraham is chosen. Only problem is, if any of you were reading the text of Parashas Lech Lecha on Shabbat, did any of you find that story in the Torah? Oh, well, it's not in the Torah. Again, it's a medrash. It's an important story. It tells us something about Abraham's background, but it's not what the Torah tells us about Abraham. So what does the Torah tell us about Abraham? And what is so important about what it tells us? There's two ways we could do this. We could either dive straight into the text, or we could do some reflecting first. I know what I'd like to do some reflecting first. Okay, so the question we have to ask is, what is, if we're going to try and work out what Abraham's value is, we have to work out the problem he's trying to solve. We said that the problem that he's trying to solve up until now, we understood, is of increased individuation, increased separation and splintering from a unified whole, to the point that you become inured, you become happy with that individuation and separation. And I want to kind of try and work out and operationalize what is it to be individuated from God? What does individuation mean? Like, for example, we talk about individuation in the context of adolescence. When adolescents say to their parents, "I'm an individual," right? You get this really moody adolescents who go around saying, "I'm an individual." Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to have a separate existence? What does that separateness hold? And maybe the question that I want to ask to you to throw open this thinking, and we'll see what the problem is that Abraham has to solve and how he starts to solve it, is, where in life do I find the greatest sense of me, of my name, of my individuality? Where do I feel the presence of me most expressed? That's quite a vague question, but I'd be really happy if people would start to shout out answers. You just have to press your space bar to temporarily unmute yourself, or you can just click unmute on the screen. But I'm just trying to work out, if we're all individuals, right? As I'm not, but if we're all individuals, well, what does it mean to be an individual? It doesn't just mean being a moody teenager telling your parents, "Oh, I'm doing it my way, I'm an individual." What does individuality really mean? Where do you feel your sense of self most keenly? Like, what's most mine or me? Another way you could ask is, where is my name most present?
I think the answer that you're looking for
Joe, you're walking into like some sort of trap here, it seems, that
is
I'm
that
looking for. Your answer,
yeah,
Joe.
the answer that you're looking for, I think, is that you're most you, that you feel yourself most at home. And of course, what Abraham was told to do was leave his home and go.
Okay, so
Now you can tell me that's not the answer you were looking
it actually wasn't the answer I'm looking for. I really like the answer. So, and also, you know, there is a sense, I'm not looking for an answer. I'm looking to explore things together. So this is a great answer. But you sort of sought to go to the remedy before you got to your reflection was guided by the answers that you thought you knew, right? So that is the danger, by the way, of reading with the answer in mind. Like, for example, we know Abraham's a great guy. We know this already. So we have to read without that knowledge in mind. So we know that Abraham's going to get tested by having to leave his country, but that doesn't mean that that's what was so important about Abraham. What I'm really, so do you see what I'm saying? So that's already sort of starting to color our thinking. Now, home is a place that we feel very much a sense of our own self, our own individuality. That's true. But why? What is it about our homes that is unique? What is that? Why is that space unique to us?
We can do whatever we choose to do because that's what we want, not because someone else has told us to do that.
Francis, is that a response to why homes are special?
Sorry. No, it's what I think makes us an individual. The fact that we have self-autonomy, if we choose to take it, that we can think for ourselves, we can make our own decisions, we can equally follow other people's guidance.
Yes.
And we can be guiders.
So Francis, that's great. So you're saying our autonomy gives us a sense of individuality. So I'm looking at now, I'm going to take you to the next stage of that thought process, which is, well, what does one do with that autonomy? That autonomy is an experience, but when is it that we use that autonomy, we use that choice to then give us the ultimate sense of our own selfhood, of our own individuality? Joe was sort of suggesting there's something about home, something special about home that is our own. There might be some choice in home, in what we do with our homes. So I agree with you, Francis, that choice is a tool in order to achieve this, but I think that there's something we have to do with that choice.
Doesn't that autonomy allow you to stick to your principles?
Okay.
So regardless of what anybody else is saying, if you particularly believe in something, then you're not going to be sort of swayed by what anybody else is saying. You have the strength and the autonomy to follow what you believe.
And what would you do with those beliefs?
Well, you'd either, depending on how strongly you believed it, you'd either try and verify that belief, and if you believed it, ultimately, you'd try and persuade other people with that belief. Or if you felt that perhaps there was going to be too much pressure on you in having that belief surrounded by people who just were not going to accept that belief, then ultimately you'd leave the home that you have to try and be secure elsewhere with your belief.
And so what would you do when you go somewhere else with that belief?
You'd carry that with you, and you'd look to have sort of comfort and strength from that in the new surroundings.
So you'd build something elsewhere. You start to create something somewhere else.
Sorry?
You start to maybe create something somewhere else.
Yeah, a home somewhere else.
Right. So then we're starting to suggest that home is a place of my autonomy. Home is a place that my belief structure can be held. But home is a place in this world that I create. That's why I identify my home so strongly with myself, is because it's my created space. Or if there is another person who occupies my home, whether that's a partner or a friend or a family, that's my co-created space. That is the place that I've invested my creative power. And that's maybe why it feels so much mine, is because I've made it. So I think if I'm gonna try and take these suggestions so far, I'm wondering whether the thing which feels most intensely mine, my individuality, is where I've made something or created something.
Surely you could be challenged by other members of the family. Can't you be challenged for your individuality by your wife, your children? It's not just your house anymore. It's just not just you. Other people can challenge you. Surely members of the family can challenge your individuality.
Yeah, so Alan's saying that space isn't always occupied by a single creative force. It's occupied by multiple creative forces, and therefore, if there's another person in the house, well, their tastes will also make sure that there are certain things that hang on the walls which are in accordance with their taste, and certain things that hang on the walls which are in accordance with your taste, unless you've got someone who rules the roost, in which case it's only their taste. But either way, that there is a give and take in family. But now that we're talking about family, Alan, I think there's something interesting about the things that feel most mine. Is family, there could be a certain sense of ownership, I wonder, a certain sense of me projected into the world. There's a me projected into the world through the work that I do, through the spaces that I create, the projects that I make, but there's a me projected into the world possibly through the progeny that I create, the children that I make. That is an extension of me. You can see Simon's unmuted.
Yeah, is there not a level of egotistical nuance about what you're saying, that your individualism depends on creating something creating something in your own way, be that in your home or your workplace or whatever it might be, that in order to feel good about yourself you have to create it. It just feels a little bit like, because what if you've got a partner, what if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 of you creating the same thing, then you can't individuate there. So I just worry about the ego in there. So
we just walked to the location that I'd hoped we'd get to. Thanks, Simon. That's entirely the point.
It was definitely not a plant.
It was definitely not. But I think that's it's a great insight, which is that with every creative activity, there is a danger of narcissism, of egoism, of making this all about me. And if you take the example of a home, sort of Alan's describing this backwards and forwards, this tension within a home between my creativity, how I want the home to be, and someone else's creativity. Well, that can be an interesting sort of, sometimes quite lighthearted, but an interesting debate about how you're going to decorate, how it's going to look. 94 Gloucester Road is an interesting example of probably not that much of a debate, more just that Shoshana's got on with it and I've just said yes, but it doesn't really matter. But the point is that could be an egotistical battle. This is my home, or this is my home, this is my taste, not that. And the same thing with a project. So Simon's saying at work, if there's a project that is mine, so let's imagine that work is a really important place for your creativity to play out. There are projects that you're leading on, there are projects that you're developing. These are things that are really important to you as an individual, because that's where you express your individuality. Now, at what point do you allow this project to be shared with others? And at what point do you say, no, this is my project? That the egotism and the narcissism can come into play. And if I'm going to now give us a bit more context to this, we'd say that humanity, in their greatest expression of self, is to be the image of God. Now, when we talk about the image of God, that sounds quite a big idea. What does it mean to be the image of God? On a pshat level, on a basic level, if I was to ask you, in the creation account, man is created in the image of God. What do we know about God so far? There's one thing we know about God.
All powerful.
Pardon?
All powerful.
All powerful. That's not, we know that he can do things, but what does he do with that power?
Creator.
He's a creator. So therefore, if man is in the image of God, so then we know that man is a mini creator. That is the unique element of what humanity is. Humanity creates. They use their choice, as Francis talked about. They use their individuality to do something, to create, to build. And so what's the real trap of creativity is that as you splinter away from God with your own unique creativity, you no longer bring it back. It all becomes about you, about your self-service, your feelings, your projects, your way of doing things in the world, and you don't bring it back. Where did we see this idea of being an obsession with creativity, an obsession with their name, with a person's name, with a person's legacy in last week's parsha? Where did we see a context where this ran amok and was a disaster?
Tower of Babel.
Absolutely, Tower of Babel. So that's right. So Tower of Babel. So just a little screen share of the text from Tower of Babel. Back onto Safari, by the way. We're in chapter 11, which is last week's parsha. And everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. They settled there. Now, we're going to listen to some certain language here, which we'll find also similarly in the Abraham story, but they settle there. That means that there is a certain sense of permanence, a sense that they're going to create that home that Job was talking about. And a person, and a man says to their neighbor, come, let us make bricks, and we'll burn them hard. The first act of creativity is to create technological items, a technological advancement. That their technological creativity is going to allow them to create bricks. Now that's something which is different until now. Until now they've been using rocks. You pick up rocks and you arrange them together, and then you have a structure. Here they're going to form their own stones. They're going to make artificial rocks that fit together even more efficiently. For them, the brick was like a stone, and the bitumen served them as mortar. They become builders, they become creators. And what do they want to do with their creativity? Let's build a city, umigdal, and a tower. What's the point of a tower? The point of a tower, it doesn't serve any pragmatic purpose. It's a monument. V'rosh b'shamayim is going to be a very tall monument, as in order, the na'aseh lanu shem, we'll make for ourselves a name. We want to have a legacy, a name, that our creativity is going to be ours. We don't want to associate our creativity with anybody else. This is our project. This is our narcissistic way of doing things. And that's when Hashem says, you're misusing the power that I gave you. I made you in the image of God. I made you to be creative individuals. I made you to be people that could use your technological creativity in order to do something very special. But it's not about you. You forgot. It's not about your legacy. It's about something else. It's a similar theme that we find not just in the realm of technological creativity, but biological creativity. When Noah, at the end of the flood story, also seems to have something going on with him in the orchard, where there's a problem with his biological creativity, whereby his son attacks his biological creativity. And once again, there's an idea that Noah is using his biological creativity for the wrong reasons. Okay, so what do we know about Abraham? And let's jump in. We've gone through after the Tower of Babel, and we've got the Eila Toldos Terach. This is the line of Terach. We've gone 10 generations on, and we're into the history of Terach with context in mind. Context is everything. There's something very interesting to read about Abraham and his beginnings that will tell us why he was chosen. Terach holed es Avram, es Nachor, es Haran. So Terach had 3 sons. So if we're going to draw like a family tree, you have Daddy Terach and 3 sons, Avram, Nachor, and Haran. And Haran holed es Lot. Haran had a son called Lot. Okay. Vayamas Haran apnei Terach aviv. Tragically, Haran died during the lifetime of his father Terach. It's a horrible thing. No parent should ever have to bury their child. Haran dies prematurely. Be'eret molate be'orkastim, he dies in Orkastim, in the land of the Chaldeans. He dies. So Haran is now dead. So you have Terach and 2 surviving sons, Avram and Nachor. What did they do? What did Avram and Nachor do? Vayikach Avram v'Nachor lahem nashim. Avram and Nahor, vayikach, singular verb. That means that one of them, Avram, is doing something and Nahor is copying him. They're doing one thing. Vayikach, they're taking. That same language of taking is a very important language. It denotes marriage. We talked about it in other contexts as well. We'll see it appear, that word again. But Avram and Nahor, they take for themselves wives. Shem Eshes Avram Sarai. The name of the wife of Avram is Sarai. Shem Eshes Nahor Milcah. And the name of the wife of Nahor is Milcah. Bas Haran. Notice that Milcah is the daughter of Haran. Avi Milcah, who the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, meaning Haran, the dead brother of Avram and Nahor. He had Lot as a son. He also had Milcah as a daughter who Nahor married. The Avi Yiska, and Haran had another daughter called Yiska. It's a great name, by the way. This is a very important name. Okay, so this is where our daughter's name appears in the Torah. And why is she mentioned here? Who is she? She wasn't seemingly in this verse. We said Avram and Nahor, in response to the death of their brother, their premature death of their brother, they get married. Nahor marries his niece. Nahor marries his niece Milcah. Avram marries a lady called Sarai. But then we hear about a lady called Yiska. Who is Yiska? By the way, when we named Yiska in Kingston, so not many people were used to the name Yiska. So people came up to me after Yiska was born on a Friday. So I walked from Kingston, and Shoshana had to stay in hospital for a couple of days. So everything was fine. She just needed some monitoring. So I walked from the hospital and over to the shul to name her on Shabbat straight away and to see the community. And after shul, they said Yizkor, memory. That you named your daughter Yizkor, and I said no, her name is Yiska, Yud Samach Kaf Hey. Why Yiska? So if you're in Safari, it's an amazing thing. You can double click on the verse, and you can pick out a commentary, and you can open up Rashi, and Rashi says Yiska. Yiska, this was Sarah. This was Sarah, which means that when we understand what's going on, why is Yiska mentioned? It's because she was already talked about. She was talked about because Avram married Sarai. Who was Sarai? It was also his niece. That means that the dead brother Haran had 3 children. Haran had a son called Lot, a daughter called Yiska, and a daughter called Milcah. And the 2 brothers, Avram and Nahor, in response to their 3rd brother's premature death, decide to marry their nieces. Now, why is she called Yiska? This was Sarah. She was also named Yiska, and there's different reasons to describe her as Yiska, from a root meaning to see or to look. So to gaze at something is the root sacha. Why? Because she could see the future by holy inspiration. She was a prophetess. She could see things very deeply. And also because everyone gazed at her beauty. She was a very beautiful woman, as we know from the rest of the story, that when Avram takes her down to Egypt, he's worried that she's so beautiful that she's going to get taken and they're going to kill him. The name Yiska also has a reference to a dignity and nesichut, right? So Yiska, the sacha, to see, but also nesicha, a princess. Just as the name Sarah has an allusion to ruling Srara. So Sarah is a princess, she's a ruler. Yiska is a nesicha, she's a princess. So that's why we say that Yiska, our daughter, is our deep, beautiful princess. But that's beside the point.
So Rabbi, so why mention Sarah in the first place if she's already going to be mentioned as Yiska?
As Yiska. So I think there are probably multiple different people have the more complex a person you are, the more names you have, right? So in the Torah, so Moshe has 7 names, and other people have multiple names. I think the reason here is that there's probably a birth name, and there's probably a name that is the way she presents herself to the outside world. So that's I imagine that's the answer there.
You also see it when Avram remarries Hagar.
Right, and then she's called Keturah. That's right. So there are. It seems that you're right. It's a good question, Jeff. Why she has to have 2 names, but hidden in that text, therefore, is a message, which is that Avram and Nahor. The first thing we ever hear about Avram is he performs an act. What's that act? To marry his dead brother's daughter. Why is that significant? What's significant about marrying your dead brother's daughter? Now, there is a portion of the Torah that does also talk about marrying your dead brother's family. What's that called? That's called Yibum.
Yibum.
Yibum, absolutely, Jeff. So Yibum is this idea that if two brothers, Kiyeshu Anashim Yachtov, when two brothers will dwell together, and one of them won't have any progeny. Now, in this case, he did have progeny, but there's still this idea that one of them didn't have progeny, and what you'll do is you will marry your dead brother's wife in order to maintain the name of your dead brother. There's a loyalty to your dead brother, which is an amazing thing if you think about it, because if we were talking about our creativity, coming back to the topic, where might our creativity also be most keenly expressed? In our ability to bear children. Those are my children. And I think that many parents or many children will find this tension of individuation when parents say, no, no, you're mine. You're not doing your thing, you're doing my thing. And children are saying, no, no, I'm not doing your thing, I'm doing my thing. And that is a point of one of the greatest creative powers a human being can have, is not just about their technological creativity like we see in the tower, but also their biological creativity, that they're able to bear children. And Abraham takes that creativity, and you could say that could become narcissistic. That's the fear that through narcissism and through one's own self-interest, I won't allow my children to be under the name of someone else as well. My brother died young. My brother died prematurely. I could just leave his legacy as going to one side. I'll deal with my legacy now. Instead, Abraham says no. He's the one, vatikach, a singular verb. He's the one who takes the initiative, and his brother Nahor follows suit to marry his niece in order to attempt to offer in a selfless act to marry his creativity with a greater purpose, with a greater good, to challenge narcissism, to challenge the trap of creativity. That is why Abraham is chosen. But it's also the tension that we will see Abraham grappling with throughout his life. Let's see a little bit more about Abraham's selflessness, not just in the realm of biological creativity, but also in the realm of technological creativity, and then we'll introduce the challenge. Okay. So we go back to our Sefaria, and we're going to move on for a second, and we understand that Abraham, so he's got his challenge of Lech Lecha, you have to go. We saw that already mentioned by Joe. And what does he do? He goes off, and he goes off and he leaves the land, and they get to Canaan. What does he do when he gets to Canaan? So Vayera, so we're now in chapter 12, verse 7. Vayera Hashem al Avram. God speaks to Abraham and says, to your progeny I'll give this land. Vayiven sham mizbeach la'Hashem hanireh elav. He builds there an altar to God who appeared to him. And then what does he do? Vayetet misham ahara. He goes from there, and he pitches his tent. Let's just contrast. He carries on and he builds another altar later on. Let's just contrast. For himself, he pitches a tent. For God, he builds an altar. What's the difference between pitching a tent and building an altar?
Altar's more permanent.
An altar's more permanent, absolutely. An altar is a permanent stone structure. A tent pitched is not a permanent structure. It can be pitched, it can be dismantled. And so even in Abraham's technological relationship with the world, with the structures that he creates, he's devoting his creativity in terms of the permanent structures that he builds to God, to a higher power, and he's leaving his own self in a more temporary way by pitching a tent instead. He doesn't build a house, he pitches a tent. And even though God said, this is going to be your land, you could argue that he knows this is going to be his land, so why not build a home, build with bricks? No, he says, I'm building not for me. I'm not presenting my own creativity for me. I'm using my creativity to build something for Hashem. And I think, therefore, we see that Abraham is someone who is willing to grapple with the essence of his humanity. If the essence of his humanity is creativity, and the trap of creativity is egotism and narcissism, Abraham is willing to grapple with that narcissism and egotism, and instead uses creativity to perpetuate the legacy of his brother in a proto-Yibam-like act. And he's able to use his creativity to build technological structures, not for himself, but rather for God. Often we'll see a person who is good to humans, often a person who's good in one area will be good in another area. If you care about God, you care about people. If you care about people, you care about God. If you don't really care about anybody, you just do things for your own rights, for your own reasons, and therefore you're just sort of like a maverick in one area, and you won't be any good necessarily in the other area. But if you're someone who's deeply caring about an other, whether that other is God or that other is someone else, another human being, you will live with that sensitivity. And that's what Abraham does. He weds that sensitivity to others in order to use his creative powers to help others. So if you wanted to therefore understand the map being you individuate from God and you come back, how does that work? Abraham is starting to give us a roadmap for doing that. Yes, individuate, become the most creative individual you can possibly be, because God gave you a gift. Okay, God gave you a gift, which was to become the most creative, the most talented, the most unique individual, because that's what he wants you to be. He wants you to be a powerful person. Don't think it's about you, though. Don't think it's about your projects. Remember that it's about someone else's project. It's about God's project. It's about doing things for others, helping others, using your creativity to spread good and light in this world. And that's why Abraham is chosen, because he's willing to grapple with that issue. Comments before I move us on to now Abraham's challenges, because he's so challenging. Yeah.
I've got the question. You're saying that he recognized God, the permanence for God, and then the first thing he does after he builds the altar and he pitches his tent in Canaan, which he's been asked to go to, is he then leaves because there's a famine. So it's almost as though the first time it actually gets difficult on a human level with the famine, he ups and runs. God doesn't tell him to go to Egypt; he goes. So isn't that a little bit?
That's great.
Isn't that a little bit?
So Joe, what other challenges does Abraham face? Because we've presented this sort of like rosy picture of Abraham, the selfless individual who's willing to put his creativity on the line for others, but it's not so simple. Where do we start to see Abraham being challenged?
And he can't have children.
Oh, amazing, amazing. The very verse after he marries Sarai, after he marries Yiska, Vati Sarah Akara, Ein Lavlad, she couldn't have children. He had all these great intentions, but he is, the best intentions, Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. So I actually quoted that today to one of my new vicar or reverend friends in the area, because he's the vicar who's married to a Jewish lady, so he likes throwing Yiddish at me, so we were going to do the remembrance service together, and he'd done the most extreme risk assessment. He'd been liaising with the council in order to make it all happen, and then lockdown. So I said, "Men tracht and God lacht." Man plans and God laughs. So, Abraham, with all the goodwill in the world, he can't have a baby with Sarah. So,
doesn't God promise Abraham that his offspring will inherit well before he finds out that he can't have children?
So chronologically, Simon,
I can't remember. I might be wrong.
No, but it's a good point. But the promise, I think, is a key point, which is Abraham takes Sarah. Sarai akara ein lavlad. The next thing we hear, Sarah was barren. She had no child. She couldn't have babies. That's before Abraham has promised anything. That's before we know anything about any promises. But Sarai was barren. She had no child. So that is the first, and it's interesting. You might almost ask, why is that the first thing that we hear about Abraham and Sarai? Why is that so important to him?
But also, why would that make him think he won't have offspring? Because one wife wasn't common then.
That's true, but remember that the offspring that he wanted to achieve, if we're going to take this theory through, is he wanted to achieve offspring that weren't just about him. He wanted to achieve offspring in this great, generous creativity, this selfless creativity, which would be devoted to his brother. That was the plan, and then she can't have children, and then I think that the challenge becomes even more that God starts making promises to Abraham. He says, I'm going to bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. And I shall bless you, those who bless you, and curse those that curse you. And this culminates in the promise later on that you're going to have descendants like the dust of the earth, or like the stars in the sky. You're going to be so multitudinous, and you're going to have the land. And often these blessings, they kind of sort of seem to go through the whole narrative, and we'll see why they have to go through the narrative. What each time there's an intensification of Abraham, but there is this sort of sense that Abraham is going to have kids. He's going to have a legacy, and we know he's going to have a legacy because that's the point of Abraham being chosen. So the person who has already got a innate sensitivity to how legacy can become egotistical and narcissistic is then chosen to be a person of great legacy. Why? Because he can handle the challenge. But the challenge is intense, because if you're told you're going to have loads of people that are going to follow you, you're going to have descendants, you're going to be the father of a nation, so then you can't have children with the person that you wanted to have selfless creativity with. So there's this who is going to take on my mantle? Abraham has to ask. Who's it going to be? And here the plot thickens. So Abraham is told Lech Lecha, he's told to go. And there's a repetition in verse 4 and verse 5 of chapter 12 that seems, but an intensification too. So let's read these two verses and see the difference. Vayelech Avram ka'asher diber elav Hashem, and Abraham goes forth after, as God had commanded him. Vayelech ito Lot, and his nephew Lot goes with him. Avram ben chamesh shanim, the shivim shana, but says mecharon. And Avram is 75 years old when he leaves Haran. Karen reading, Vayikach Avram es Sarai ishtoi, and Abraham takes Sarai his wife, es Lot ben Achiv, and Lot his nephew. We just read and all the stuff that he gathered. Literally all the souls that he made in Haran. He went off to go to Canaan, and he went to Canaan. So there is a seemingly redundant repetition from verse 4 to verse 5. What do you see as the repetition from verse 4 to verse 5? Anyone?
Lot going with him twice.
Yeah, that's right. Is that Jonathan?
Yeah.
So we've got Vayelech Lot, Lot going with him, and then we say, and Lot went with him, and then we just add in a detail that he's his nephew. It's interesting. Do we not know that Lot was his nephew? And it says Vayikach Avram takes, again that word Vayikach, and he's taking es Sarai Ishto. Sarai is his wife. Did we not know that Sarai is his wife? He's taking a whole load of different parts with him. And also, why do we need to know that he's 75 years old? Why is that relevant to his journey? What's the fact that what's that got to do with anything? Well, I'd say like this. If you're Avram and you think that you're going to be the father of a nation, well, you're kind of wondering what sort of father is that going to be? Because at the moment, the biological father part is not really working. You're 75 years old and you haven't been successful to have a child with this woman who you wanted to have selfless creativity with. But we know that fathers of nations don't necessarily have to be a line of biological descendants. A person can be the father of a nation without being a biological progenitor. For example, Americans call Washington the father of the nation. but not because Washington's son or daughter became the next president, but rather because the values that Washington stood for, become the values that then mark what it means to be part of American society. So if Washington is he's the father of America, but without being the biological father. So maybe Avram is going to be the non-biological father of this nation. He'll be the kind of the spiritual, the moral father of this nation. And how do we see that? Well, who's he taking with him? He's taking Lot ben Achiv. He's taking Lot, the son of his brother. Here, maybe Avram's saying, well, you know what? If Yibum isn't going to work for me, if I'm not going to be able to perpetuate Haran's legacy through his daughter Yiska, maybe Haran's son will perpetuate my legacy in a backwards Yibum. He's got Lot. Lot's with me now. Lot ben Achiv. Lot is the son of my brother. He could be my sort of spiritual son. And so let's take all the stuff, let's take all the things that we've gathered, let's take all the accoutrements of a nation, of a people, the people that I made in Haran. Some people say that wasn't mean the people that he made, that means his servants. Other people say it's the people that he introduced to monotheism. And let's go as a group, and maybe now there's a sort of ambiguity. He's taken Sarai Ishto and Lot ben Achiv. Who's going to be the one to follow up this nation? There's an ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, we see Abraham sort of maybe saying Lot is going to be the one. And he's distancing himself somewhat from Sarai. Where do we see the greatest distancing from Sarai in this story? Where maybe Sarai is relegated to some other relation.
When he goes to Egypt.
When he goes to Egypt, and how does he describe her in Egypt?
His sister.
His sister. And it's true. Because in a certain level, she is his sister. She is his brother's daughter. She is his niece. So on that level, maybe she's just his sister. She's just related to his. And at that point, God has to help Abraham assert, no, she's your wife. She's your wife. And he lets Pharaoh know that, no, she's his wife. And so there's a challenge here. How is Abraham going to manage to be the most creative individual he can be, to hold on to the blessings of God, that he's going to be a great nation, and yet not make it about himself, not make it about his own search for legacy. And so here Lot becomes the tricky person. When do we see Abraham let go of Lot? We've gone through this is the Egypt part.
After they part ways.
They part ways, absolutely. So he goes and we see Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not support them staying together. The land could not support them to dwell together, to sheves, to dwell together. If you read those two words, lasheves yachdav, to dwell together, where else in the whole Torah have we seen the idea of brothers dwelling together? This is spooky, and you'll like it. Where else? Seeing brothers dwelling together. So let's open up a new summary page. Go on.
It's not the Jacob's sons.
No, this is actually.
Is this the tents of when he looks out the brothers living together? The tents. When he goes to curse.
So
they dwell together.
It's a good suggestion, but it's in the last book of the Torah, and it says it's the parsha, is the part that deals with Yibum, with levirate marriage. Ki yeshvu anachim yachdav, when brothers will dwell together. Umeis echad mehem, one of them will die. Uben ein lo, and they won't have a son. Lo yisya eishes hameis hachutza liish zar. You shouldn't leave the wife of the dead body to some foreign man. Yavama yavalea, you should do Yibum with her. V'lo chalo liisha v'yibma, and she'll take her for a wife, and you'll do Yibum with her. And the firstborn son that will be born, the first son that she bears will be on the name of the Achiv HaMeis, or we establish on the name, remember name, legacy, on the name of the dead brother, his name, his legacy will not be erased from Israel. Look at that. Ki yeshvu achim yachtov, when brothers will dwell together. Over here in Genesis, we see that the brothers, he's described Lot as his brother. They couldn't lasheves yachtov, they couldn't dwell together. In Deuteronomy, in Yibum, when they dwell together, here they couldn't dwell together. Abraham and Lot, there's a tension in their Yibum. Abraham says, maybe Lot can be mine. Maybe Lot can be my child. Maybe he'll be the future. I'll leave Sarai as my sister, not my wife. I'll take on Lot. But no, they can't. They can't be together. And there is an argument between the shepherds of Abraham and the shepherds of Lot. What's the argument about? So if we click on here, I think, is it Rashi? Will tell us what the argument was about. Because Lot's shepherds were wicked men and grazed their cattle in other people's fields. Avram's shepherds rebuked them for this act of robbery, but they replied, look, the land has been given to Avram, and since he has no son as an heir, Lot will be his heir. Lot's going to be the son. That's what the shepherds are saying. And scripture, however, says that the Haknani v'Aprazi az ba'oretz, that the Canaanites and the Perizzite, they abode there in the land, so that Abraham was not entitled to possession. So Abraham says, you're being too hasty. You're being too hasty. We don't know that Lot's going to inherit. And even if Lot does inherit, it's not inheriting yet. You're jumping the gun. It's the wrong time. You're being too hasty. But what do we see? Even the shepherds are feeling out. Maybe Lot's going to be the heir. But the verses are saying that no, they can't be together. There's going to be a breakdown in this Yibum. And so there is a split. Why? Anashim achim anachnu. At the end of the day, we're just brothers. We're not dad and son. We're going to have to leave it. You are the son of Haran, and I am who I am. And so Lot separates, and he finds the good land. And where does he go? He goes to Stone. He goes to the city of Stone. And at that point, the narrator, also known as God, tells us something. The Anshe Stone ra'im v'chataim laHashem ma'od. The members of Stone, they're very wicked. They sin against God. Why do we need to know this now? With the story of the destruction of Stone isn't going to come up yet. Maybe it's because God is telling us that the rationale for the break between Abraham and Lot was actually a breakdown, not only in terms of their relationship, but also in terms of their values, that Lot was not the right person to be the continuation of Abraham's legacy. And at that moment in time, God speaks up. And God speaks to Abraham after Lot has separated from him. Look in all directions. Look to the north. Look to the south. Look to the east. Look to the west. Look in all directions. Because I will give you all this land, and you're going to see your offspring forever, and for your offspring forever. So at this point, Abraham feels vindicated. Abraham feels that actually he's passed the test. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know why his creativity is not going to find its happy home in his nephew Lot. But he recognizes that Lot is not going to be the one to continue the legacy. And at that point that he lets go of his own sort of egotistical search for legacy, it's where God intensifies the promise of legacy. When you can let go and you can say, I don't know how this is going to happen, I simply have faith it will, then God gets involved and says, yes, we're going to make this happen. You've had enough faith in this process. You can actually individuate and be the most creative person you can be. But when you realize that your own plans and your own egotism has reached a limit, and you can pull back and say, this is not the route anymore, then we have an intensification of blessing. I'll just give you a sneak preview of where we're going to go with this next week, which is that actually for the rest of Lech Lecha, we see an further intensification of this challenge. Because what happens next is that there's this Mesopotamian battle between 4 kings and 5 kings. It seems to be entirely irrelevant to the story. There's this record of a battle of the kings. But what happens in the battle of the kings is that the king of Sodom is involved and Lot gets taken prisoner. And then Abraham gets involved, and through sort of a miraculous act, Abraham is able to recapture Lot. Now, if you're Abraham, what do you think? You think, I just let go of Lot and God intensified the promise. And then through some sort of divine providence, Baruch Hashem, finally we have Lot back again. We finally have him back. You think that this is God's machinations, that God is saying you have to learn to let go. And when you let go, Lot is going to be brought back to you. You're going to capture him back. But then what happens? The king of Sodom says, you can have anything you want from the booty of war, but I want all the people back. So Abraham, in one fell swoop, loses Lot again. And then at this point, Abraham cannot contain himself. He can no longer restrict himself. He has to shout out to God and say, look, you've promised me legacy. You've promised me all this future. You've said that my creativity is going to be married up to a great vision. But who is going to inherit me? I don't have Lot. I have nothing. All I've got, says Abraham, is this Damasek, this Eliezer, my servant. All I have is him. So what will be the future? And at that point, God lets us know what we already know because we're reading with the end in mind. But Abraham doesn't know that, but God lets him know, you're going to have a biological child. You are going to have your own biological child. It's not going to be Eliezer. It's going to be okay. You will have a son. The problem is, which son is it going to be? And what are you going to do with that son once you've got him? And so I'm already sketching out what next week's Chasing Lullabies is going to be, which is the tricky relationship between Ishmael and Yitzchak. And not only that, but when he finally got Yitzchak, God's request, I'll take that legacy back. Can Abraham continue grappling with what it means to be a powerful, creative individual, promised a legacy for all eternity, but letting go of his own autonomy to have faith in God's plan, even in the face of darkness, even in the face of no hope? His wife is barren. His son is not the son that he'd intended with Ishmael. And finally, the son that he gets is going to be taken away. Can the hope of a biological future be balanced against a faith in a plan that is beyond him? And so I hope that tonight we asked a question. The question was, why Abraham? Why would Abraham be chosen? We said context is everything. The context is that we've worked out that what does it mean to be a quintessentially human? It means to be a creative individual. That for 6 days God created, and on the 6th day, the finale of creation was to create mini creators, who on the 7th day would desist from their creative labor, just as God desisted, to recognize that actually, ultimately, all that creativity comes from him. But what does it mean that you're creative? You dissociate, you individuate from God by becoming the most creative individual that you can, but there's a narcissism there. There's a trap of creativity, which is it becomes about me, about my project, like we saw with the Tower Builders, like we see with Noah, like we see with the Garden of Eden. There's a trap in creativity gone wild. And Abraham is able to offer an alternative, creativity wedded to something greater, whereby my biological creativity can be offered up as a legacy for my brother. My technological creativity can be offered up as a legacy for God. But what do I do about my own creativity? Because I'm a powerful individual. I'm Abraham. And I've got to grapple with what it means to let go of my own sense of self, even when I've been promised a legacy, and instead have faith in something else and something greater. This is the journey that Abraham has begun. And this is the journey that he will continue as we chase away the lullabies next week. Thank you very much for joining me on Chasing Lullabies this week. It's a real pleasure to see you all this evening. I just heard some very sad news whilst we were on the Zoom that there's been a shooting in a shul in Vienna. So I want us all to pray now together a psalm for whatever has happened there. So I'm just going to say Psalm 120 on behalf of us all. Shilma alois, Esa'inai el hecharim me'ayin yavoi Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai, Esei shamayim va'aretz. Ali Tena Maglecha, Alianum Shemrecha, Ine Loyanum Velo Yishan, Shemer Yisrael, Adonai Shemrecha, Adonai Tzilcha Al Yad Minecha, Yomama Shemesh Leakeka, V'yareach Balayla, Adonai Yishmocha Mikol Ra, Yishmor Es Nafshecha, Adonai Yishmor Tzeitzcha, Uvoecha, Me'atav Yad Elam. My friends, may we have good news. Let's learn Torah together, let's daven together. Let's pray that everyone should be well. I'll see you, please God, next week on Chasing Lullabies. Anyone wants to stay for comments and questions, please.